Good morning, everyone. All right. Can I start, Andrea? It's good time, all right? What is up with the snow? I mean, it is maybe spring is near. I don't know. But my job is pretty simple here. It is to welcome everyone. My name is Orlando Watkins. I'm the vice president for programs here at the Boston Foundation, and I want to thank you all for coming. I see a lot of my friends who I've been in this work with for a while. I see a lot of folks who have come back for multiple of these conversations, and it gives me a lot of hope that we are sort of on a journey together to really address these larger DEI issues. So thank you for being here. I also want to thank the Barr Foundation for co-hosting this event and being such a great partner on this effort and so many others. Because of Barr's support, the Building Movement Project is able to conduct an in-depth analysis of the Massachusetts data from the National Race to Lead survey. So thank you so much. I also want to recognize the incredible leadership of one of my teams, the nonprofit effectiveness team led by Jennifer Aronson, whose vision it was to sort of take the foundation deeply into this DEI work. So thank you, Nonprofit Effectiveness Group and Jennifer, for all of your leadership here. And I also want to thank our forums team. Is Michelle Hinkle in the room? She's not here. We do a lot of these forums and convenings at the Boston Foundation, and they are, a lot of logistics, as you could imagine, and there's just a team of folks who put these things on for us and mostly go off without a hitch. So I just want to recognize Michelle and your team for all of your great work. So many of you probably most of you are familiar with the Boston Foundation. We were founded in 1915. We are one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the country. And, we are investing in the cultural and cultivating the vibrancy of our communities. And there's so much about the work and history of this institution that I'm proud of. Among the many things, the history of this institution investing in leaders and leaders of color. Most people might remember or don't remember that this institution had the first African-American woman CEO of any at a major U.S. foundation. Also, the first woman of color as its board chair, Frida Garcia. So there's a long history of this organization supporting leaders of color, being in community and fighting for justice and change with leaders of color. The job, I've been in the job for about a year and a half, and it gives me a real interesting perspective on this community. And what I've learned is that there is no lack of talented leaders of color in this city. I'm learning it every day. And even on this pipeline issue, young people doing amazing work in organizations sort of ready for the next challenge. The question, I think, is do we have the will to tackle the structures and the barriers that prevent leaders of color from ascending to board seats and EDs and CEOs. So I feel that's a part of the work that we're here to do together. I also feel like it's not all bad news. I've been amazed over the last year or two the level of conversation and dialogue around race and racism and unusual characters stepping up to be a part of the conversation. I've done this work in 4 or 5 cities, often involved with the DEI kind of work. And I feel there's something different happening in Boston. So the question is, will we sort of stand up and really lean into the opportunity we have to have a different set of outcomes? So a little bit about the series of conversations. The series started with the Opportunity and Change report, which identified key challenges and structural barriers facing nonprofits. Last fall, we continued this discussion with the Boston release of the National Race to Lead report, which suggested a new narrative that organizations need to look inward to address systemic and structures that may limit access to leadership opportunities for people of color. Today, presentations will focus on Massachusetts' subsample of National Race to Lead survey and contextualize the data for our Commonwealth. So we hope today's conversation will serve as really more fuel to continue this journey, because it is a journey. It's going to take us a while to get to where we want to go, but we're hoping that creating this space, this data, will continue to feed our desire to create change in our sector. And just so you know, at the Boston Foundation, we are also deeply engaged in our own internal sort of look at diversity, equity, inclusion. I think I might have mentioned in the last gathering, on my team, we've developed a set of action-based principles to think about how we show up for a community and how we support leaders of color within our own organization. So we are a part of this journey with you, but we don't have all the answers, so we need you as full partners as we think about how this community foundation shows up for a community. So thank you for being a part of that journey with us. So now I'm going to turn it over to Francis and Sean, the co-directors of the Building Movement Project, who will walk us through the report findings. Again, thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming on a snowy April morning. So my name's Sean Thomas Brightfield. I'm the co-director of the Building Movement Project, and I'm going to start out by just giving you a sort of very brief overview of some of the findings from the national report, just so that you have the bigger, broader context for the data that we looked at here in Massachusetts. And to get started, just want to give you a little bit of background on who we are. The Building Movement Project is a national organization founded almost 20 years ago. And as an organization, we focus on doing research in 3 areas that we think are really important for nonprofit impact and effectiveness. One is movement building, how organizations can collaborate and work together to have bigger impact on progressive social issues. Also, we look at service and social change, how service organizations that are providing needed services in communities can also do and should also be doing social change work, meaning advocacy, meaning engaging their constituents in advocating for themselves and for policy change. And then we also look at leadership. And for many years, a lot of the leadership work looked at the generational shifts that were happening in the nonprofit sector. And then with this work, we have really been focusing much more on race as the primary focus of our leadership work. On the service and social change front, we do have this satellite website called Tools to Engage. So we're going to do a shameless plug to check that out. If you're interested in community and constituent engagement, there are a lot of resources that we've developed, but also pulled from a whole host of other organizations around the sector to basically curate this site that has a bunch of resources that can be useful for organizations. So to dig into the national results, the first thing to understand is why we did a survey. So we had heard from people in communities of color, people who had been working for many years in communities of color, that they were seeing more white leadership in their communities and fewer leaders of color. And we thought that was counterintuitive, especially given the conversation in the sector about the importance of diversity. And so it left us with this question of why were we not seeing more leaders of color in the nonprofit sector? And there were a whole variety of nonprofit surveys that demonstrated that actually, as a sector, we were not moving the dial. So Compass Point, a capacity builder out in California, had done a survey, I think 3 times over the course of a decade plus, that had pegged the number of CEOs of color at around 18%. And then BoardSource also has been doing a survey roughly every 2 years of both nonprofit CEOs as well as board chairs, and similarly found smaller percentages of people of color in those top roles, and that the numbers had not budged basically over 2 decades. So if we've been talking about diversity and investing in programs to support leadership development of people of color, why were we not moving the dial as a sector? And so we started out by doing interviews with around 36 people in the sector, some capacity builders, some trainers, some executive recruiters, some CEOs, to ask that central question: why was it that we weren't moving the dial? And we heard a lot of explanations or a lot of hunches about what was behind not changing the data. And then when we did the survey, we basically tested out those assumptions. So one was that people of color were just not as prepared for CEO roles. And so when we looked at our sample of over 4,000 people who took the survey, we didn't see big differences in educational background. We also didn't see big differences in terms of the kinds of support and training that people received, like official training that people were receiving. We also didn't see big differences in terms of some other measures or other assumptions you would have about what would qualify people, like how many years people had been working in the sector. So we thought, okay, this education or qualifications excuse is not something that's borne out by the data. We also heard that people of color maybe didn't want these crazy nonprofit CEO jobs because, those jobs are so overwhelming, and people, want to make different choices about their life and career. And we didn't find that to be the case. Again, and this actually is a very similar finding from other previous surveys, particularly looking at young people in the nonprofit sector, that people of color actually had a higher aspiration to lead nonprofit organizations than their white peers. And then we recognized that when we tested out some of the explanations that we came up with based on the interviews that we had conducted, that people recognized that these barriers were systemic, that there were structural barriers to people of color moving into more senior roles in the nonprofit sector. And so some of the explanations that had the most support or most agreement had to do with challenges around executive recruitment, challenges around white boards and board leadership failing to support people of color, and then this nebulous concept of organizational fit, which often is basically a container for implicit bias, and so allows for organizations to let their biases sort of have an excuse for why not to fairly consider the person of color who may be applying for a senior role in the organization. The data also showed that there were some particular challenges and barriers for facing people of color in the nonprofit sector. So you can see, unfortunately, the demanding workload one at the top is a little bit cut off, but you can see with demanding workload, everyone is stressed out about demanding workload. It's roughly the same for people of color as for whites. No surprise there. Inadequate salaries, the gap starts to increase. And then lack of relationships with funding sources, the gap gets even bigger. But then we saw the gap was particularly large around lack of role models. And then this additional demand that people of color face in the nonprofit sector being called on to represent a community. And that showed up in a lot of the write-in responses as being the person who is tasked with fixing the race problems inside of the organization, and or being the person that everyone goes to for free advice about how to access the Latino community surrounding the organization. So that kind of demand to represent was a particular challenge and barrier that came up in the national data, and was, again, not just in the data, but was reiterated and reflected in the kinds of write-in responses that we got to the survey. The other thing that I want to just be clear about is that race is actually a factor. When we asked people about the factors impacting their advancement, we asked about their schooling, we asked about their track record at work, we asked about their gender, we asked about their sexuality and class background, and we also asked about their race. And so basically a third of people of color felt that their race had had a negative impact on their career advancement. And we got a heartbreaking number of write-in responses about very clear and explicit instances of racism that people were facing inside of nonprofit organizations. So that's sort of the summary and review of the data. And so to the point of like what the new narrative is or should be for the nonprofit sector, I think first off, we do have to recognize that nonprofit leadership doesn't reflect the communities that are largely being served, and that people of color in the nonprofit sector are actually experiencing overt and very clear racism. And then on top of it, everyone thinks that diversity is a problem, that it should be a bigger priority for the nonprofit sector. So when we think about what kinds of solutions we should be pushing for to support people of color to move into more senior roles, we have to stop thinking about people of color as the unit that needs to be changed. We have to think about the organizations and structures needing to change to actually support people instead of erect barriers to their advancement and hopes to move into more senior roles in the nonprofit sector. So I'm going to turn it over to Francis to talk about the data that we found when we looked at the subsample of respondents in Massachusetts, as well as what we heard from the focus groups that we conducted here.
I hate podiums. I'm short. So you see this like little head coming out in the podium. I don't like that. And can you tell we're New Yorkers? We're speaking so fast. And I'm going to speak fast too because Jen said we only had 25 minutes to do this. So if you can't understand us, too bad. we're very happy to be here. We want to thank, of course, the Boston Foundation and the Barr Foundation, and also people who helped us to conduct focus groups, the focus group members. There was a lot of people who contributed to this report. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Massachusetts data. Sean will kind of bring it home. And where's my little children thing? This thing? Oh, green, yeah. You can see how well I am in technology, fulfilling the older white woman role of not knowing how to do technology. Let me start by saying that there were 176 respondents to the Massachusetts data. So we're going to give you kind of the trends, but we know it's a small number considering there were over 4,000 responses to the national survey. But what I'm going to do is kind of compare what the national survey said and what we found out from Boston respondents. But to supplement the findings of the data, we held 4 focus groups in the Boston area. Actually, the 176 are Massachusetts, not just Boston, but we held the focus groups in Boston. So we had a focus groups with white executive directors and CEOs, with women of color, who worked in, these are all people working in nonprofits, and that actually were some executive directors as well as staffers, and then separate groups with white executive directors and CEOs, and then white staffers. So you're going to see some quotes throughout this, but we really appreciated people giving us our time because it really helped us get a much more nuanced view of what was going on with the data. The other thing I want to say is that 58% of the respondents were from the greater Boston area using the Boston Foundation's zip codes. We went by zip code to find out who was there. And then 42% were from outside the greater Boston area, just in case you wanted to know that. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the Boston data. First of all, if we look at the responses by race, very similar to the national data. 42% of the national respondents were people of color, 40% in Boston. Where you'll see some differences is that there were more African American or Black respondents in Boston than in the national data, 23% in the Massachusetts data, and 15% overall. And fewer Latinx, Latino, Latina, Hispanic, 4% in the Massachusetts data, where it was 11% overall. So you see some differences here. In terms of gender, 78% of the respondents in the national survey were women. That's actually very close to what is true in the sector. 71% overall of the workers in the nonprofit sector are women. In Boston, a little higher, 80%. Sexuality, 21% of the Boston respondents were LGBTQ, 20% in the national survey. So very similar in terms of demographics. Not exactly the same, but very similar. I wanted to dig a little bit more into the education findings, just to give you an example of like how we were looking at the data. In these other areas, very even responses between people of color and white. Here we see that in the national data, there's 38% are millennials, a little bit more in the Massachusetts data, 42%. Were millennials. What was interesting to us is there were fewer Gen X. I don't know, somehow, you know, maybe I was here in the Boston area when there was a lot of Gen X, but in Massachusetts there were fewer Gen Xers. These are not great numbers. It's not big numbers, but just thought you could see some of the differences, and then a little bit more of the post or pre-boomer generation. I looked at also at this by race, just to give you an idea. And in the national data, very evenly distributed between white and people of color respondents by age. But here, there were more millennials of color in the Massachusetts data, and then fewer people of color respondents in Gen X and in the boomer plus generations. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 issues that we highlight in the report, and you can download the report on our website. And we have another satellite website. You know, don't tell communications people you're not supposed to have satellite websites. So it's called www.racetolead.org, which has all of our reports on there. We've done several other reports, but we're going to highlight 3 areas. One is just the challenges facing aspiring leaders of color. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of the fundraising issues facing all executive directors, but people of color executive directors, and then we're going to talk about just the hiring process. So I'm going to go over the aspiring leaders of color, and then Sean will take over after that. So let me just start with some context in Boston, some quotes from some of the people that we interviewed. So this was a person of color who had grown up in Boston. I was born in Boston, raised in Boston, the whole 9 yards, but if you speak in a certain way, you carry yourself a certain way, potential funders wonder, why are you here? And she's answering, I'm here because I'm part of the community. But this issue we found facing executive directors and staff of color, that the assumption that if they were professional, they weren't of the community, just the kind of different communities and the segregation that was going on in Boston was notable for us leading these focus groups. So that's just one of the quotes. Here's another quote from a white participant. She had worked at a national organization, and then they had directors in different cities. And she said that every time they tried to recruit a person of color to come to Boston, they would not come. They would say, oh, like, where would I live? Or what would happen with my children? Or, I'd love to come, but my spouse, oh, no, my spouse won't come. So this is her quote about what it was like to try to recruit people to come. And this was particularly to Boston, not to Massachusetts generally. And then this last quote was very common. This is from somebody in the executive director focus group about the old money. This came up both, especially in the executive directors groups, but both the white executive directors groups and the people of color executive directors groups. This idea that the money's kind of locked up in this old money where people of color really do not have the access to that money as in the same way that white people do. And there was a lot of conversation about elite access to funding, which could be true in other places, but seemed particularly true in the conversations we had here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this aspirations to lead. So first of all, Sean told you already, you can see this kind of bottom half of these graphs are the national data, and the top half is the Massachusetts data. So you can see that first one, the gap 10%, that more people of color wanted to lead in the Massachusetts data, in the national data. That gap actually is smaller in Massachusetts. Pretty much the same number of people of color have aspirations, but more whites had aspirations to lead in the Massachusetts data. The other thing that we thought was really interesting is that there are also more people of color in the Massachusetts data that say, I definitely do not want to be, or definitely or probably don't want to be a nonprofit leader. So we were surprised by that. It's not a huge difference, but we thought we would kind of think about why that was true. So first of all, we looked at this thing about why people of color don't want to be leaders. So this is very small numbers. Just let me say that before I do this. Like I'm sure there's some statistician that's going crazy right now. But so you have, like, these are only people asked this were not CEOs and EDs, right? If you aspire to be a leader of color, we took out all the executive directors and CEOs that responded. And then of that, we're taking only that small group that said, I really don't want to lead. But we were still interested because it was different than the national data. So these are trends. You might want to look more into this later on. But what we found is that there were more people of color who said that they actually didn't have the skills or were well suited. Watch that. Well suited to be executive directors in the Boston area, and also that more people of color than in the national data were interested in going to another sector, either the public sector or the for-profit sector. So that was just an interesting finding. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I also just wanted to point out, though, this work-life balance. If you look at the national data, pretty even, work-life balance, this isn't for me because I want work-life balance. Look at this difference in Massachusetts. Under 20% of people of color say work-life balance is an issue. Over 40% of white respondents thought that was an issue. And we actually had some conversations with people about that, and maybe some of the panelists will talk about that later on. We're so happy there's a panel to interpret all this data for us. Digging a little deeper into why people might not. So now we're back to the full Massachusetts sample. We're not in this little subsample anymore. We did ask people the types of supports that they had in their job, and they ranked the supports, and you can see here again later on, if we want, we can go more into this, and you'll get these, these slides will be sent out to you if you want them later on. What we thought was really interesting is how few people of color overall, and especially in the Massachusetts data, had mentors at their job. So having mentors in their job, and how important, if you read the literature, it is to have these mentors in your workplace. So here's a quote from one of the respondents who, in the executive director group, saying, and this was very common in the people of color focus groups, how they had to seek out supports outside of their work, that they were not supported in the work the same way that they felt their white colleagues were supported. So I had to seek people out because I had so few leaders of color. The other thing we looked at is some of the challenges and frustrations. Sean showed you a much bigger slide of that. We're just showing you a little piece of that. We were interested that in Massachusetts, more people of color said that there were few opportunities for advancement, that they were feeling the barriers. We heard this in the focus groups, and it was reflected in the data. They felt blocked in advancing. And here's a quote from somebody saying, a lot of organizations I work for, there's not an opportunity for upward mobility. Now, in both the white and people of color focus groups, there's also this, in nonprofits, we're very small. Many of us are very small, so you kind of hire in, and then in a couple of years, you hope those entry-level people go someplace because there's no place for them to go within the organization. But this was something else that we heard from the people of color focus group, like, there wasn't going to be any room for us to grow. And we were a little surprised by that. So might want to think more about that. In this area that Sean noted, that how people felt that their race negatively impacted their career advancement, pretty much the same result on the negative impact in Massachusetts versus the national data, about a third, 2% less in the Massachusetts data, not a big difference. What was interesting to us, though, is look how many people said that their race positively, people of color who said their race positively impacted their career advancement more. And we were like, whoa, where does that come from? So we did actually focus group that particular response. And I wanted to give you some of the quotes we got here. This is from a white person in the white staffers group saying, my guess is that people she's talking about people of color have more initial opportunities, but then I'm curious about kind of their long-term trajectory. And that really actually reflected what the people of color focus groups said, where they said, people want us in the room, and we're there to represent the community, but we're not there to advance in the organization. This came up a lot. We're there, because actually what people said is, a white executive director has an idea. They don't have any access to the communities of color. They hire us to come into the communities of color, but they're not going to let us actually make any decisions in the organization. We're here to implement the ideas of the white executive director. So on that very positive note, I'm going to hand it over to Sean to talk about the other two issues.
So, as Francis said, advancement was certainly one of the big issues, but so was access to money, because we know that funding for your organization is a big part of the executive role. And so we had a set of questions in the survey about access to money, what it takes to do the fundraising. And we had some interesting responses here related to both the particular barrier that people of color-led organizations have to accessing the money compared to their white peer or white-led peer organizations, but then also the frustration that people experience around the relationship building and the relationship management with funding sources. And so in general, I would say that the national and Massachusetts data look pretty similar. And so I don't want to suggest that there's a particular barrier here in Massachusetts. This is a national phenomenon. But as the earlier quote showed about the perception that the sort of money is held in a particular set of very elite relationships that are long-standing and connected to money that was earned by the family or created by the family many generations ago, that was a particular issue or barrier for folks of color in the nonprofit sector here. And also there was a frustration that we heard in the focus groups that there was a sense that young white entrepreneurial types have a lot of doors open for them. But that same kind of support is not available for people of color with similarly interesting and brilliant ideas about how to make change in communities. And so that was a particular set theme from the focus groups that may relate to the elite universities in this area or a whole host of other factors. But one of the white people in the focus group also had a perception about like what the leadership responsibility was of current leaders in their organizations to position staff to have access to funders, because there was a sense that those relationships are sort of held or hoarded by the current CEO. And so that was a failure to plan or anticipate the needs for future leaders to have access to funders. We also had a set of questions around just getting into the top job, right? And so as I had showed you with the national data, there were concerns about executive recruiters, white boards, and then this perception of fit. And again, the Massachusetts data largely paralleled the national data, but I think the quotes provide some particular state and city context. So one person in a focus group was saying that boards may say, of course, we want a person of color, but then this idea of, well, does the person fit with the organization is already a problem, but particularly a problem when an organization is not ready or willing to confront how white culturally organizations can be. And so what it is to fit into an organization can be particularly problematic when an organization is sort of saying that they want to diversify and yet expecting someone to fit into a sort of organizational culture and structure that is not supportive or inclusive of people who come from different backgrounds. So, and then there was also this piece around the particular challenge and frustration with executive recruiters. And I think it's important to provide the context that when people are experiencing this kind of dynamic of being up for the top job, being considered, and then never getting that final, yes, you got the job, when they're getting that, when they're having that experience over and over again, that's what creates the frustration. And so it's not so much that they didn't get the job, it's the sense that you are being used to diversify a pool, but not in order to actually be put forward as a real candidate. And so having had some conversations with other executive recruiters, certainly part of the challenge that recruiters face is that they are tasked with providing the pool of candidates, qualified candidates, and the board is ultimately the decision maker. And executive recruiters may not have the skill or authority to challenge the board when they see biases playing out in terms of who the board is considering or rejecting. So questions about what can be done, what the recommendations are. The report has 3 recommendations, and I'll go through each one. So the first one about following the money. Basically, we think it's important that organizations led by people of color get investment, and that funders can be doing audits to reveal whether there are disparities in their own grant-making practices. And that would be an important step to both analyze the problem, see what's happening, but then also help to create a push to increase investment in organizations led by people of color. Yes, we also need to diversify white organizations, but I think it's important to be very clear that organizations led by people of color do exist and are under-resourced. We also think it's important to, when we're thinking about developing pathways, that yes, career ladders matter, but given what we heard from people in the focus groups, we also need to be thinking about career lattices so that people are enabled and supported to zigzag across a sector, so that because it seems that it's not, there are not many places where there's going to be opportunity for people to move up and stay in the same organization for a decade. And so if we recognize that people are going to be moving from one organization to the next, how can we support across multiple organizations in the nonprofit sector to make that be something that is supported and possible? And that means both supporting people who are transitioning from organization to organization. It also means supporting the organizations themselves so that there's some stability when someone moves on to find more opportunity and advancement in another organization. But altogether, it can ultimately support the development and the strength of the nonprofit sector and knit organizations together. If leaders are moving from organization to organization, it can be a net benefit for the whole nonprofit sector. It doesn't have to be a loss for an organization. We also think it's important for just leadership is important. And so that leadership often does have to do with the board leadership. But also we heard from the focus groups, both doing focus groups with executive directors of color as well as white EDs, that there's a hunger for community to have these conversations in both focus groups, and it also seemed important to be able to have conversations across those racial lines as well to really be able to make some change and progress on these issues. So those are the 3 recommendations. I just want to end by sharing a little bit about what BMP is planning for the future. So we put out the first national report on the overall 4,000 responses that looked at the data at sort of a macro level. And then we've put out a report on the LGBT subsample, and then we also put out a report on the subsample of respondents in the state of California. And now this report on Massachusetts. And so what we're planning to do for the rest of the year, we want to do another deep dive around CEOs and executive directors, in part because what we heard from the focus group with CEOs of color was just so interesting and rich. We want to be able to do that at a national level. We also want to look at the intersection of gender and race, because again, what we heard from the focus group with women of color was so interesting and rich, so we want to do that at the national level. And so we'll continue to do these kinds of deep dives in specific places like we did here in Massachusetts. And then the plan is to resurvey in 2019. So if any of you didn't take the survey last year, if everyone here does, we would double the number of respondents from the state of Massachusetts. So thanks for both the opportunity to share this data, and I want you to please welcome the panel.
Okay, thank you, Sean and Francis. Your report is sobering confirmation that we need to do more than just talk about this issue. We need to take action to dismantle the very real barriers to success that people of color leaders face in the nonprofit sector. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Aronson, Associate Vice President for Programs here at the Boston Foundation. I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. And as they're getting settled, I have a couple of thoughts to share with you. First, I'd like to acknowledge Sheriff Tompkins and Marty Martinez, Chief of Health and Human Services for the City of Boston. We're very pleased to have you here, and any other public officials, and all of our good friends and thought leaders and partners in this work. So thank you for being here. I'd also like to thank the Barr Foundation for funding this report, and in particular, Kim Haskins. Kim was a partner, a thought partner, and a huge support in making today a reality. So thank you, Kim, and thank you, Barr. In this room a few months ago, we heard from a panel of sector leaders that shared their personal and professional perspectives on the national Race to Lead data. Trina Jackson, Shahir Mustafa, Deb Ray, and Danny Rojas all spoke about their own experiences with structural barriers to diversity and inclusion, and how race-conscious practices that address issues of implicit bias can lead to systemic change. And it's important to keep in mind the thread of this conversation as we hear today from some of the gatekeepers that were identified by Building Movement Project in this Massachusetts report. Because if we truly want to make progress on this issue, and I have a feeling that the people in this room really do, then we really need to listen, understand, and learn from the great work and the conversations that precede us. And that's what today's really about. It's about learning from one another and then taking action together so that we can move beyond this nonsense. Okay, there's no other phrase I could think of to summarize what is happening in our sector other than nonsense. So let's get started with the panel discussion so that we can get right into the conversation. I'm not going to read all of the impressive bios of our panelists, but they are included in your packets, and I encourage you to read their bios. I'll start by asking the panel to respond to the 3 key findings of the report. So Michael, we'll start with you. As a longtime HR professional with experience in the private and nonprofit sectors, including Boston Architectural College, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, and most recently the YMCA, Please kick us off by commenting on the first finding, that aspiring leaders of color lack mentors and receive little encouragement to move up within their organizations, so instead have to develop skills and find advisors outside of their jobs to continue to advance.
First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It's been a while since I've been in this room. But in reference to the question, I do agree that there is a level of support needed, but I don't think the issue is around mentorship. I think it's more about sponsorship and organizational will when we look at support for diversity and inclusion from boards. So the gist of it is I've been a 20-year HR professional. I've been in 5 executive leadership programs, some of the best in the country. I've had my MBA for 20 years, but yet I'm still not a CEO. But as far as mentors, I have dozens. But as far as organizational will, as far as sponsorship, someone speaking on my behalf when I'm not in the room, where all the real decisions get made, that doesn't happen often to a lot of people of color.
Thank you. Amari, as an experienced nonprofit executive who's served in top leadership roles for several organizations, including Friends of the Children, Jumpstart, and currently at Parenting Journey, please speak to the report's strong theme around the, quote, racialized challenge of career advancement in Massachusetts, where it is difficult for people of color to move beyond narrowly structured, often frontline roles and advance into upper-level decision-making positions.
You know, I think, thank you for also having me on the panel. I think the finding around having one person of color in the room is real, and I could relate to it. I was talking to a friend of mine, a mentee actually, who works at a school. I'll say it's a charter school. And so if you know anything about charter schools or schools in general, there's always this position called the Dean of Students. It is remarkable how many Dean of Students at many of the schools are a very large, robust person of color, and he was one of them. And so I thought that was interesting that the Dean of Students at many of our schools, both charter and public schools, the Dean of Students position is a very large, robust student, a person of color. And Dean of Students is the person when someone's in trouble that they go and speak to. And so why is that position a position that a person of color always occupies? And so I think that's part of it. You know, I think having positions that are specifically designed where people of color always get that job. You know, I think the other thing is, I think for those of us in the room who are of color, who come from an organizing background, I think we have to support each other doing that translation of what organizing is, which is to build relationships with communities that you are a part of and that you are not a part of, to mobilize them and to move something along using the power of relationships. That's the same thing I do when I do development every day. I build relationships to people who are like me and not alike me, who have a similar background or who don't have a similar background, and use the power of relationships to raise money. Like, that's the same thing. And so when we say, oh, well, organizing isn't fundraising, and we know that fundraising is one of the tracks that one needs in order to be an executive director, but we can't make that translation, or that translation isn't made for us, I think that's where this engagement lattice takes place, because it's the same skill set. And so we as nonprofit professionals have to take charge of what our sector is and control what it means to rise. I think we don't have to have these fixed positions of what it means to be an executive director. We can make that choice, and I think that's up to us.
Thank you, Amari. Cassie, as the co-founder and leader of Common Good Careers, a mission-driven search firm, how do Michael and Amari's comments and analysis map to conversations that you've had with your clients about their ability to support the advancement of people of color in their organizations?
Again, thank you for having all of us here. It's my pleasure to be here. I think what I'm hearing here is what I hear a lot from different organizations, both hiring organizations and job seekers who are looking to advance either within the sector or specifically within their own organizations. I think Amari's comment about really focusing on competencies and that the relationship building is the most key competency for building fundraising responsibilities and leadership is critical. I think it's also important that we think really holistically about an individual's career journey and where that person wants to go, and have mentors and sponsors. Sorry, is my mic doing something weird? No, okay.
You're doing great.
Mentors and sponsors really supporting in a very, very strategic way each individual leader's journey up the leadership pipeline. One of the things that I've been noticing recently is that particularly when you think about, we do a lot of work with boards, and so when you look at boards, I think boards have become more diverse over the last 15 years, not as diverse as they need to be and should be, but there's typically two profiles of people of color on a board. One is people of color who have access to wealth or bring wealth themselves. And another profile is community representatives, whether it's alumni for the program or parents from the school that the community serves, the organization serves. But we need a third profile on the board, and that is nonprofit leaders of color themselves who become the mentors and the supports and start to institutionalize that orientation on the board.
Great, thank you. Selena, Jocelyn, anything to add on the first finding before we move on to the second finding? No? Okay, great, because I'm coming right to you with questions on the second. I'll start with you, Selena. The report's second finding is that nonprofit leaders need to be able to raise funds from foundations and donors that often have little understanding of or contact with communities of color that they're trying to support, and that leaders of color are frequently excluded from networks and relationships of wealth, as we've just been discussing. So Selena, while you spent several years of your career as a funder, you have for the past year and a half been the executive director of the Hyde Square Task Force. Please speak to your experience with foundations and donors as you fundraise for Hyde Square Task Force and how this experience relates to the report's second finding. And please also comment, if you can, on the distinction in the report between the skill set and network as separate ingredients for success. And then afterwards, I'll turn to you, Jocelyn, for the funder perspective, and then to Amari for more on the ED perspective.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us here. I wish it wasn't a different topic. Yes, I have been now leading Hyde Square Task Force for a year and a half. And having spent, over 10 years in philanthropy, I come to the position with a certain advantage. And the advantage is that I have existing relationships in the institutional funding world. That doesn't mean that those existing relationships have materialized in automatic grants like my board, I think, thought that they would. But I do get phone calls back, which is great. So at Hyde Square Task Force, we are very fortunate in that we have not a long list, but a list of funders who have been with us for a very long time. And those are institutional funders as well as individual donors. And that is wonderful. But I know that my task, or a big task ahead of me, is to ensure that our list of supporters gets bigger, right? And in particular, individual donors. I can tell you that I do not want to attend one other workshop that is going to tell me that I need individual donors. I know that. And the challenge is not so much my skill set. I have the skill set. I speak foundation talk, right? I can present to you the work that we do with integrity, with authenticity. I can show you the numbers. I'm also a trained researcher, so I can show you evaluation data. So I can do the talk, but I do not necessarily have the audience. And that is where the challenge is. In that when you think about it, who am I? I am a first-generation college graduate. I did attend a sister Ivy League school, but it was survival, not relationships for me those 4 years. Then I'm here, I'm a transplant in Boston. I am not from Boston, even though I have spent over 20 years in Boston developing my career. So my networks tend to be redundant. They tend to be other people that are like me. They're not necessarily connecting me to deep pockets. Now, I have worked in institutions where I have met folks with deep pockets, but those have been transactional relationships. They have not been relationships of trust or deep relationships that then give me access to wealth. So I am at a sort of, sometimes there are mornings when I wake up and I'm like, what was I thinking? I had the easy job of giving the money out. And now I'm going around begging for money, and I don't have the audience. So it is a big challenge. And if we don't have access to those networks, it is hard for us to raise very important capital. And that is the capital that allows us to create stronger organizations and not just survive fiscal year to fiscal year.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Selena. You guys are giving us a lot to think about. Okay, and it's about to get even more intense with Jocelyn. So, Jocelyn, it's been my observation that the Himes Foundation is a leader among local foundations at staying connected to communities you're funding. Can you reflect on the report finding that people of color may be overlooked by funders, even though they are the leaders who could most effectively drive investments in these communities that we all care about?
So yeah, I'm going to deviate a little bit of what I prepared for because Selena, who is a former staffer at Himes Foundation, so we just have to take credit for that. So Selena pointed out something that was sort of a sub-point for me, which is the degree to which leaders of color in the nonprofit sector are so very qualified and competent. I just want that question to sort of just be dismissed, because it is. I know there was a lot of controversy when Michelle Obama said that, people of color have to work twice as hard to get half as much as their white counterparts. And it may not be a empirical truth, but it's an experiential truth. And I'll say that, and I think Selena is an example of that in many, many ways. And so what I think is a challenge, and we see this in philanthropy all the time, and part of the problem is, in philanthropy, we do good work. There is not a philanthropic institution that is not doing social good. I mean, that is there. But at the same time, there are problems that we want to take on that are complex social problems that, are pretty entrenched in this country, and we are not immune to it. And so I just want to throw out something that sticks with me. Several years ago at a Council and Foundation convening, and Council and Foundation is sort of the sector network for philanthropy. In a conversation about diversity, a leading white male foundation executive came on stage and with other people of color and other white leaders and said, if I had to choose between an unqualified candidate and a white male candidate, I'd go with the unqualified candidate of color. And so part of it is, he didn't get the support that I think he was expecting from the crowd. Not sure why he was expecting it. But that said, that gives you a little bit of the mentality that's going on, even in philanthropy, in a diversity conversation. That diversity, bringing in diversity, which Himes Foundation has focused on for at least 10 years now. We have, of late, have had a strategic framework, but the goal of diversifying leadership in the nonprofit sector, I think we have to think about that mentality. And often we think that we're going to bring these diverse candidates in and it's going to help them and they're going to have a good job and they're going to get to do good work. And what is really missing is, how is that candidate bringing something else that a white candidate might not be able to bring? A lived experience that will have an impact on the work. So where does that get counted in the hiring discussion? How does that get ranked as a competency? A person who has been able to be resilient and fight some of the barriers. Where does that get counted when we're hiring? And so I'll just kick it off with a little bit of that.
Thank you. See, I told you. Thanks, Jocelyn. Amari, let's turn back to you as a 3-time executive director with considerable fundraising experience. Do you have anything to add?
Well, 3 times means that I can't keep a job, so I might not be the one you want to ask. I'm just saying, y'all were thinking it. Y'all were thinking it 3 times? Where's this guy works? I want to focus on the last part. And so I work at an organization that focuses on families. And so here are 3 things that we know about families, especially working class and families living in poverty. So working class and families living in poverty, if they don't have access to housing, security, pay inequity, or paid maternity and paternity leave, there will ultimately be challenges in the family thriving. So we know that as an organization. So how many of you have your phones out? Could you guys do me a favor? Pull out your phones if you have your phone out, because I need some help. Come on, more of y'all have phones. Help me out. So let's do the math. So $11 an hour, if you're making $11 an hour, multiply that by 40. So what is 11 times 40? It's like 400 and something? 440. Multiply that by the amount of weeks in a year. 52 weeks? What is that, 22,000? Right. The average 2-bedroom apartment in Boston is $2,200 a month. Right? Okay, so let's go $15 an hour. $15 an hour times 40. What is that? 3,600. 600. Multiply that by 52. What is that, like? 31,000. I looked on Idealist this morning. There are 35 jobs, program associates, program coordinators on Idealist for nonprofit jobs that are starting at $35,000 a job. So here's my point. And I just told you my organization's 3 perspectives on working with families. And so if you are a nonprofit or a hirer in a nonprofit sector, and if you are hiring a person of color, someone who comes from an immigrant background, some first-time generation college student person, and you are paying them $35 an hour starting, right? 35 a year, sorry, I wish an hour. 35 a year, we are contributing to this poverty that many of the folks that we're serving are living in, right? We're a part of that system where we are actually paying people, particularly people of color. So we talk about intersectionality. We are starting first-generation college grads at $35 an hour. Why would they want to come to our sector when they could be the office manager at State Street and make 65 starting? My mentees, if they're telling me that, I was like, don't take that nonprofit job. Don't do it. Don't do it. You're crazy to do it. So that's one. So the other thing is, regardless if you're workforce development or transportation or opportunity youth or out-of-school programs, pay inequity, housing insecurity is all of our challenges. And so when we play ignorant and say it's our privilege that we can pretend like that's not really a challenge, because I try to get kids to college, so I don't have to worry about pay inequity, and I actually start my coach who are working with the young people at $32,000 an hour. I'm actually participating. So we work in a sector where we get to play ignorant. I think we call that ignorance privilege, right? And so when we get to be privileged and hire people, and when we talk about, oh, well, that's cisgender white male, he has privilege, right? So we are actually perpetuating that. So it's no wonder we have boards and people who don't look like us leading organizations. We are a part of a system where we're privileged to not even know the issues in which the people that we're serving go through, because we are pinpointing in our sector. So we like blinders on. I only work in transportation, so I don't need to worry about the fact that I'm paying someone $32,000 a year that I'm perpetuating. I don't need to worry about that, right? And so we're perpetuating that. And so it's no wonder we work in the sector that perpetuates the same type of systemic issues that happen outside of our sector. So I think we have to start by answering that question. Every time we are hiring manager, if we are paying someone $11 an hour, we got to talk to someone in our organization that this is acceptable because it's not a living wage. And it doesn't matter where you work in what sector. So that's something that we can do. So we can stop. That is what, when we talk about systemic things, that's systemic. We own that part. We are actually part of the systemic that oppresses through how we hire, or the fact that we accept paying people at that rate. And that's just one thing. So I'm going to stop there because I keep going on. But that's an example of how it works.
Amari, thank you. Yes, if anyone here thought we were just going to sit back and feel sort of like other people need to make the change. This Amari really pointed out that we are the change. We need to make the change, right? And we need to stop perpetuating these challenges and these root causes that Amari articulated. So thank you, Amari. And I think we can all agree that this is related to our budgets, right? Just to bring it back to fundraising. I mean, if we had larger budgets, hopefully we would be spending them in part on creating career-sustaining and family-sustaining wages for our staff. And so I'm going to turn us back to the report, to the third finding that sheds a light on the barriers that people of color seeking leadership positions face, and to bring race back into it, because that's a real part of it, that they face from white-dominated boards and executive recruiters that often voice concerns about ability to raise funds and assumptions about skill level. And so I'm going to turn back to Cassie, and again, as the co-founder and leader of a search firm, how does this map to your experience and the conversations that you're having with clients and the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we see that and hear that from organizations all the time. And the frustrating position that we feel that we're in is that we're also at the same time talking with amazing leaders of color who we know have the skills, have the competencies, might not have the networks and the access to the networks, but our client organizations typically aren't, at this point, they used to be, but they're not at this point expecting that leaders are going to come with existing networks that all of a sudden are going to fund their new organization at high levels. But they are looking for the skills. And so, you know, what we really try to focus on is breaking down what does it mean to be a fundraiser, and really think about what are the pieces that add up to a competent and strong fundraiser, including things like project management, relationship building, which Amari, you know, focused on in his conversation earlier, and really storytelling. And there are loads and loads and loads of people who are phenomenal storytellers, whether they're people of color or not. And those are the folks who live the experiences of the communities that they're serving, the students or constituents that they're serving, who can tell the stories that are compelling. What they need at the initial stages, we found, is the partnership from the boards, who typically do have more of the access to the networks, so that they can tell the story to the right audience.
Thank you, Cassie. Please, Selena.
You know, when I think about the boards do play a critical role, but depending on what type of organization you are leading. So when I think about Hyde Square Task Force, we are an organization that was grassroots born, right? It was born out of the community, by community leaders. The board, for the longest time, has been representative of that community. So in that sense, the networks are not necessarily there. So that, and yet it's something we honor, and we pride ourselves in ensuring that our board remains representative of the youth that we serve. So there's got to be a different way, and I would challenge us that there's got to be a way of putting us in front of people with wealth that have the ability to give and want to give, because it's not a matter of they don't want to give, they do, but giving us an opportunity to be able to talk about our work so that they see the value of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
And I just want to add, too, that I do think that it is part of the role of philanthropy to add to the networks of leaders of color. I think we know this is happening, and so as we think through not only whether or not we're going to give a grant, but like how are we going to, knowing that this leader of color is going to have a little bit more difficult time fundraising, not even a little bit, I got to take that out, a difficult time fundraising. And I've been there because I was a fundraiser at one point. One is just getting into the networks, and so that's something philanthropy can help with. And we do try to connect our executive directors with other funding networks. It's harder with donors. And that's a particular challenge here, as we talked about earlier, the old money, because some of it, how are you going to displace the neighbor that, you know, the kid of the neighbor that, you know, grew up with you? How are you going to choose a person of color that you don't know, that's not from another area? So I think definitely trying to work on those networks is a very critical piece of what has to happen. Yeah, and I'll just stop for there for a second, just for a second. Got more.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think I want to come back to the conversation about individual donors because that is such an area of huge disparity and hopefully great opportunity. But before we do, Michael, I just want to turn to you again in your role as an HR professional. I want to ask you to talk a bit about your interactions with executive recruiters and boards of directors, again, bringing it back to the report, and what you make of the report's finding about the barriers to navigating these gatekeepers.
I think that organizations basically have to be more courageous. CEOs are hired by boards, and they set the tone and the culture. And so a lot of times, or as a HR executive, basically I'm one of the gatekeepers, but I work for a CEO. And so I have to be willing to have the courageous conversation with the boards and with my CEO about why are you making these decisions, and you're taking risks in other areas, but you won't take risks in this area. Because a lot of times they're faced with, do I do what I think is the right thing, or I do the things that keeps the lights on and keeps the paychecks coming into our employees? And at the end of the day, they're not that bad people, but they're always choosing not to take the risk. Because it's about who you're familiar with, who you're comfortable, and who you trust. So if your circle of people look and think like you, and you can rely, and they're all big bankers, then you're always going to lean that way, and it's not going to allow for other diversity to come into the mix. So what I've done is I've taken and pushed the conversations as well as help facilitate training for our board so that they're aware of their biases. I'm not going to say it's a quick fix, but over time, they're basically participating more actively in diversifying our organization.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to turn back, I think, to one of the central themes of the report that is so important to all of us, and the ability for us to deliver on the missions of our organizations, and that's this issue of access to resources. And I'd like to dig a little deeper there. So the report touches upon two related but very different and maybe even opposing forces at play in the funding arena. On the one hand, we've heard about this move to diversify white dominant organizations, and on the other hand, the need to support people of color dominant organizations. And so Jocelyn, I'd like to ask you about this one as the only current funder on the panel. Can you speak to the perception that these resources are more likely to be committed to, as we've heard, support for diversity programs of white-led organizations, or as Sean mentioned, go to the next new idea from a white leader, as opposed to funding existing community-based organizations?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think the whole conversation around diversity in the nonprofit sector, it's gone very well here in Boston. But in terms of, do those diverse leaders really have a pathway for advancement? That's a different story altogether. I think that, we've been doing a number of programs that really encourage organizations to diversify. But then when it comes to funding leaders of color, like people of color-led organization, I think what happens in philanthropy in general, but we do try to pay attention to it, but it's not, I don't want to put us out there as we've perfectly got this managed, but there comes in that question of risk, and what do we mean by risk? And that's a conversation that I've been thinking a lot about, of late, because are we willing, there is this idea, and I think it may have come out in a report that I've seen, it maybe the national report, but there's a lot less trust of people of color leaders with the money. So there's this idea that people of color may bring this lived experience that's great, but can they really handle the finances and do what needs to be done? So that's a question out there that I think philanthropy needs to take a really hard look at. What does it mean to have a track record? On the other hand, too, I would also say that, we're not valuing the lived experience as a particular way to bring about effectiveness. So we ask for impact. But, you know, when it comes to, can you raise money? Do you know the right people? Or do you have the lived experience, which is going to make your work effective? We tend to weigh more on the track record. That group knows that they, you know, they haven't had any problems. You know, they have a dedicated finance person, which is a big luxury for a nonprofit organization. So I think, you know, as the sector, I think we really have to look at some hard structural inequity, some really difficult bias, implicit bias in the sector. It's hard because we're working for important things like social justice. So then to say we have to do it in our own backyard, but of course we have to do it in our own backyard because those decisions are playing out, and they play out in ways that seem neutral. You know, well, you know, this person has an MBA, you know, so, and they're leading the organization, and sure, the issue is, you know, teen youth in Roxbury, and no, they never lived there, but, you know, they can bring, financial stability to the organization, but what can they bring in terms of other aspects that will make the work more effective? And I think we've just got to be smarter in some of our decisions. And then even when we see that there may be capacity needs, we treat them like capacity needs, you know, instead of like, oh, you know, you don't have experience in that community, so hire an outreach person. So, oh, you don't have experience in finance, so let's just hire you. It's something that can be learned, you know, let's just hire you a person who can help you with that. And then look at leadership differently.
Great point. Thank you. Selena, could you put your funder hat back on and maybe weigh in, drawing from your time at the Himes Foundation and BNY Mellon and the Smith Family Foundation?
Sure. That comes easy to me. So, you know, I was reflecting on the point that was made in the report from the focus groups here locally. And I was thinking about how, with the exception of Himes, because I just, you know, Himes is a very different place. That's where I started my philanthropy career. I learned a lot of great things there that I tried to apply in every other institution that I went to. But having worked in corporate philanthropy and then a small family foundation, you know, there were oftentimes looking closely at the grantees, the leadership of the organization, asking the race and inclusion you know, question, that did not come up. You know, it was not about, you know, I would raise it. I would be like, you know, if you look at my portfolio, you know, we have mostly white leaders that we're supporting. Are we okay with that? And oftentimes I would get, but, you know, the beneficiaries of the services are of color. So therefore, you know, there is representation there. And, you know, I would push as much as I could. And oftentimes I did see the white leaders get support at significant levels in a much faster way. It's almost like the leader of color had to jump a couple of extra hurdles to prove that they were indeed had the capacity, had the skill set, and were able to deliver on whatever the project that was being put forth. And so I'll give you this example. I'm not going to name organizations, but I remember this one white leader who is very well known in the city and had this one wonderful idea and said, I have such a great idea to be able to get more youth of color to have access to college and be able to graduate in a way that is very non-traditional, has support, etc. I am a youth development person. I just thought the idea was brilliant. I'm like, of course, it's wonderful. And I said, I want to support you in whatever way I can. So we're talking, and he says, you know, I just need about $1 million. I need $1 million, and I need to raise it within a year. I said, oh, okay, great. You know, at this time I was working for an organization that had the kind of, you know, deep pockets. And I said, all right, let me see what I can do. So enamored by the idea, great. I go back to my organization. I start talking about it. And sure enough, I knew that it wasn't going to take long before I got the group excited because it's another white leader. They recognized the name, et cetera. I was going to be able to move it. I go back to this leader not even 6 months later, and I said, so, you know that $1 million you talked about, can we talk about it more? He's like, oh, no, I forgot to tell you. I raised the $1 million. I can tell you that I have I have people of color, executive directors of color that I know, my peers now, that we could come up with a brilliant idea tomorrow. And it would not be 6 months later that we can say we have our seed investment of $1 million. By the way.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So much to add, but I'm not on the panel, so so let's keep going. Yeah, Jocelyn, please.
Aspect, we were talking about this recently because there is a psychological element that I haven't studied, but I feel it to be true. I feel that when I'm engaging with white male leaders of nonprofit organizations, there's not this question of begging. So I feel like for those leaders, they're like, this is the money, you have it, I want it, give it to me. It's sort of like, you say you do this, okay, where's my grant? And for people of color, it's a different story. And I find myself in conversations, and even as a leader of color, at a foundation, it's sort of like, I can prove, let me start by proving to you that I really can do the work that I came here to ask you for money for. And then even just lowballing it, because, and it's not as if people of color are sort of somehow mistaking their value or not leaning in. It's just that they've gotten the no's. So they know, so they're asking, so they don't come with that same sort of, hey, I know you're going to give me the money because you should be. Look, I'm doing you a favor. It's really more like, I really got to serve these communities. Can you see your way clear to understand that your foundation actually supports the very thing that I'm doing? So it's a very different conversation, and I find that fascinating, but just a play out of kind of what's really happening.
Totally. So insidious that it even when it may not be present in a specific conversation, we've been so conditioned that we bring it, that the energy continues there, really. And Amari, please.
I would say, as someone of color who has had to fundraise, I think there's a programmatic role to fundraising, that if you are a Black, Latino, Asian fundraiser, woman fundraiser, there's a programmatic role, because there's sometimes when you're fundraising, language is used and you just can't sit there and take that language, right? And sometimes you have to a little bit more than you want to, but you can't sit there and take, and Marty in the back is shaking his head, you can't. And so your program role as a fundraiser, as the chief executive, the program is called New Language for Funders. And so I'm constantly, when someone says at-risk youth, I'm constantly saying, yeah, we work with opportunity youth, right? And so it is a programmatic role. I have programmatic outcomes, and I'm measured by the amount of dollars that I raise, right? By change, and through my own staff's articulation of the change in language that our funders use as well. And so I don't just get to go to a meeting, ask for resources, and get the resources. I'm trying to do that, and I'm trying to, at times, change the language, reframe the context for funders. That's a programmatic part of the fundraising job. It's an additional responsibility that Selena and I have when we fundraise. We have to, it's called a language context conversation at all times. And I think that's very different. And it requires a different level of energy when you're fundraising, and sometimes at the cost of fundraising. And I think thinking about agencies that were, when I started in '96, I think there were 15 unapologetically African-American organizations in Boston. I think there's 3. And so I'm talking about like organizations like Lena Park and Roxbury Multi, they don't exist anymore. And I think there were probably 12 Latino organizations. I think there's like 5 now. Like there's 5. I mean, and I just don't mean a brown person leading the organization. I mean, it's like Susan G. Komen being run by a bunch of guys, right? And so these are these kind of organizations that were for a specific population group that understand the culture, that don't exist. They have struggled to raise money and maintain their capacity. And I think, I think we gotta identify that and raise that up. What about the dismantling of the Roxbury Comprehensives, et cetera? Like what's happened? Or the La Alianzas, what has happened to those organizations that that part of this fundraising dynamic has basically eliminated these institutions in our community.
Really, really, yeah, clap to that. Really important point about this distinction between diversifying white dominant organizations versus supporting people of color led and people of color dominant organizations. And also I hear another theme that's related to the national findings that Sean and Francis spoke about when they were here in October around people of color being called upon to represent at no additional cost, right, communities and move the needle on this little culture thing we have going on, right? So really, thank you. Some powerful examples. And before I move on, Michael, I just want to turn to you because I know you were on the grant making committee at Blue Cross Blue Shield. And when we spoke in preparation for today, you shared some really interesting anecdotes about that experience.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I learned a lot. Basically, there's a lot of organizations that have contribution committees where they make decisions on what they're going to fund based on the return that they get. So if they're going to increase their membership or something to that effect, that often trumps a worthy cause such as child literacy in a Black community or something like that. Not to say that's always the case, but it is a factor. When you don't have someone with a different perspective on those decision-making bodies, then the voice does not get heard and communities go underserved. CEOs and executive directors of color basically don't get funded. Therefore, their organizations close. So what we have to do is make sure that we're diversifying those committees and making sure that organizations hear from you. You know, we do business with these organizations, even if it's not as large as, 4 million members or something to that degree, but we do have a voice and we got to assert that voice collectively. And I don't see a lot of that happening all the time. So we have a lot more impact and influence. We look at these young kids that just got together and protested. Yeah, individually they're a 16-year-old kid, but collectively the nation heard them, the world heard them. And we need to think about that when we're talking about funding too. I think there's some opportunities that might not be addressed currently. I'm not gonna, that's another workshop.
Great, thank you. So in a moment, we're going to move on to solutions, but I first wanted to turn back to you, Cassie, and give you the opportunity to respond to some of the findings, including that nearly 3/4 of Massachusetts respondents felt that executive recruiters don't do enough to find a diverse pool of qualified candidates for top-level positions, and that in both focus groups that Sean and Francis ran with people of color, or I guess Sean ran the ones with people of color respondents, they reported that uniformly negative experiences with executive recruitment firms and did not find executive recruiters useful for filling positions within their own organizations. Any responses?
Who envies me? So I think it's really stark, and I think that data is extremely disappointing. I want to recognize that I think the executive search industry is sort of seen as monolithic, that this is sort of how executive search goes or how executive recruitment goes. And there are lots and lots and lots of different variations of how an organization, how a firm does search. I think generally search firms have been too slow, much too slow to sort of keep up with the times and adapt their work and their work internally, as well as their work with their hiring organizations. And I think Sean made a point earlier that, we work through influence. Many of you work through influence in your own roles, but we work through influence. We don't have any authority on who ends up getting hired into the role. We have a lot of authority in the early stages of the process, and that's where we have to take responsibility for making sure that our processes are as free of bias or that we're as aware and mitigating that bias as humanly possible. I think that there's, sort of a view of search firms from the hiring organization's perspective, and then there's the job seeker or the candidate's perspective. And I think something that struck me that you said, Jocelyn, from a from a grantee, a fundraising perspective, is that there's a psychological thing, and I think that sometimes we as executive recruiters don't recognize the psychological challenge of putting yourself forth for executive positions over and over and over again and not getting any traction on those positions, and we need to do a better job, certainly, of that. Executive search firms are not a panacea, and different organizations are going to use search firms in different ways and for different reasons. And so the idea, I think, from our perspective is we need to find the best partner for us, the best, fit organization for the work that we do and the way that we do it. We've done a lot to try to ensure our own processes are the bias is as mitigated as possible, and that we're really, really strengthening our team's ability to use influence, whether it's a single hiring manager at an organization or a search committee or a board. I can go into some of those specifics if folks are interested, but this is really a call to action for all of us, and I would specifically ask that we at Common Good very, very open to feedback. So if you have something that specifically that you'd like to share with me, either as a hiring organization or as a job seeker, my door is open, my email is open. I'll stay around for a little bit after this conversation to hear from you if you'd like to.
Great. Jocelyn, please. Yeah.
I do just have one comment on that, because we use executive search firms for both our in senior level hires as well as our board search. And my understanding is that at a point in history, the board was told, we just can't find any more qualified people. And I think changing what you mean by qualified, like, to what degree does the candidate outside of their professional endeavors embody the mission that you're seeking to make forward in the world, the one you want to realize? And I think that there's not a question on that. I haven't ever gotten a question. I've told my story, which has some elements in that, but that has never been a question. And so I think that needs to be a question, because then you have more data. You have, well, this person can do this, this, and this, but on, point 6, they absolutely have no capacity. So when you take that in consideration, I think that that's one way to look at it. We have since had very diverse pools. I mean, I'm a product of an executive search firm for my foundation. So I think what I'm understanding, what we did was we pushed back and said, we want this to be majority people of color. You find us the candidates that are majority people of color, and then we can have a conversation about what are the various capacities and which ones, are more likely for us to be able to fill, or which ones do we need and which ones do we not need at all. So I do think that it starts with insisting on a diverse pool. Just insisting that, yes, there are qualified people of color. So your job is to find them.
Yep. Yep.
I'd like to add just a couple of things.
Please.
So first, you're absolutely right. And one of the sort of constructs that we use is really thinking about strengths that a candidate will bring, and strengths being very, very broadly defined. It could be a very specific skill, or it could be a softer skill, or it could be a set of experiences. But then also, what supports would that candidate need if placed in the role? Every candidate for every position is going to need supports. They're just going to look different depending on who the person is and the background and experience that they bring. The other piece is around, please do tell us your story. We try to ask for folks to tell us their stories, but we need to be careful about liability issues, and we're sort of constrained. So please do, we want to hear your stories so that we can share those with our clients. Absolutely.
I have a question, though, because part of the report talked about supports after hiring and advancement for careers. So I just wanted to make sure that, there are questions that might be asked, or there's an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. That was a major focus of the conversation in October, was hearing from practitioners about how they support staff to be successful after hiring, because of course the hiring is just the the tip of the spear, and then there's retention, and there's promotion, and there's actual inclusion, like being included in the leadership and the power. So yes, we can certainly spend some time today talking about that as well. And actually, Jocelyn, why don't we start with you? Maybe talking about, maybe we can start talking about how HIAMS works with grantees, with nonprofits to influence that, and how you signal that it's important to HIAMS as a funder, and then we can sort of go down and hear from others about some processes and practices, anti-bias processes and practices.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is fascinating is that often we hire a person of color to come in and bring their diversity, but then bring it out in a way that looks exactly like a white male model. So it's like you're supposed to be, I don't know exactly, schizophrenic, I'm not sure. But I think that part of what we can do in philanthropy is we can know, all the great points that were brought out in the report, and we can be on alert for it. So one of the things that I know that we've done that I look for is that when I see an organization that has provided a career advancement for a person of color, they've worked their way up the ladder, and they're in a leadership piece, and we're considering funding them, I do make it very clear that that is part of why they're getting funded, because they've been able to really take advantage of the many skills and resources that this person brings to the organization. And I am trying to validate with them that we see it, and we want to support you in doing that. And so looking for ways to think about our grants and have that conversation with the organization about, do you need to have more professional development built in here? I notice you just promoted someone. So we can be a little bit more proactive. And so that's one of the things that I've seen. And also just really knowing, I recently have been thinking about the beg factor, and I'm not sure why, because I did have to do development work for a long time. And so I try to make it so that it's not a conversation about, you need money, I have it. It's a conversation about, we're both trying to get something done in this world. Okay, what do you have to do it? What do I have to do it? How can we get those two things together? So I think when you have conversations like that, it is better to really then realize the resources that a leader of color may be bringing to you, because that will open your eyes to strategies of resilience, which, I'm sure Selena and Amari can tell you all about.
That's great. A phrase when you started speaking, Jocelyn, came to mind, this idea of hiring for diversity and onboarding for assimilation, right? And that's what we're trying to combat here. So I want to open it up to Q&A in about 5 minutes, but maybe we can just continue to go down the line. And Selena, we can turn next to you. And I know that High Square Task Force has a relatively diverse staff and board, and maybe you can talk a bit about how that came to be and how you engage on issues with race and equity. That would be great.
Sure. So as I had shared earlier, we came out of community need. So it was a group of neighbors that came together, mostly of color, to develop the organization in response to what was going on in the Latin Quarter at that particular time, which is the High Jackson Square area of Jamaica Plain. Since then, our board has always been representative of the community, which has been predominantly Latino up until now. We can talk about gentrification. That's a different conversation altogether. So one of the things, though, that I have been doing over the past year and a half is recognizing that our board had been a size of 9 for a very long time. Most of our board members, long-time, dedicated folks from the community, which has been great. But we were stuck, and we needed to expand. So those conversations around expanding our board, we were very thoughtful about, and took the time to really think about the makeup and what it is that we needed to have on the board in order to be successful. So definitely doing some of the very sort of standard assessment of skill sets, et cetera. But as we were thinking about particularly this idea of expanding networks, there were moments of tension on the board of what happens if we start bringing more bankers, right, into the room. So I remember pushing back and saying, all right, let's just not talk about bankers in coded language. Are you talking about white, males with wealth? Yes. Okay, let's name it. Let's talk about it. And let's start thinking about sort of why is that, why are we afraid to do that? And so we started to have real conversations on the board around that. And then it became very clear that, no, we do want some of them, right? But we also want to make sure that we have primarily people of color on the board, primarily folks who understand where we've been, where we came from, right? And the type of organization that we are and the value what we do. So one of the things I remember with my board chair, we started to go around town having conversations. And I did walk into some of the financial institutions that, through my time at BNY Mellon, was very familiar with. We walked in, and one of the first maybe 2-3 sentences in the conversation and the getting to know you was like, look, we're very interested in, exploring this opportunity with you. And mostly, actually, it wasn't even white bankers that we were talking to. The majority of them actually were bankers, Latinos, but that had been coded as not Latino enough, or labeled not Latino enough because, they were at a certain stature. So it was very interesting to go and have these conversations. But one of the things that we did, and we were very honest about, I was very honest about, I was like, listen, we might be in the paper tomorrow. And we're not going to be in the paper because our youth are graduating at wonderful numbers, right? We might be in the paper because we got really upset at what's going on in the city. And we decided to go and make some noise. And so our youth are out there and they're advocating and they're in the paper. Are you going to be okay with that? Or are you going to hide your paper and say, yep, I know nothing about Hyde Square Task Force? If that's the answer, this is not the board for you. So you need to be okay with the entire work that we do and not just an aspect of it. So having very frank and honest conversations. And then we've expanded our board actually by 6 individuals over the past 6 months. And they all passed the test. So it's being very honest and not be afraid to have the conversations.
Yeah, great. Michael, I know you were trying to get in, and that maybe you can talk a little bit, and then we'll go to Amari and Cassie before the Q&A about your approach to anti-bias policies and procedures for hiring and onboarding.
So I'm very proud to say my organization has a really great set of policies, but that's not where the action happens. There was a conversation about what happens after you hire diverse individuals. So, you hire them, you put them in place, and then it's like sink or swim. And we all know, historically, some organizations only give certain people a certain number of chances to succeed. And so what we do intentionally is we've developed a network of diverse leaders throughout the entire nation that actually have national conferences where we invite aspiring leaders of color to come together and learn best practices and build a network of support. And so what is happening is it's built a movement within our movement. And anytime you have a problem, you don't have to work directly with that person at your particular association. You could pick up the phone and call a network and you'll get plugged in. And a lot of these individuals, some of them have been with the Y and retired and still provide executive support. And so they teach you about gravitas, all these things that you don't learn in school, but are the success factors that help you at work. And so as far as a network of individuals supporting staff after they are hired, I think we do that well. Our issue is getting them through the door at the beginning. We're working on that. But at the same time, I would tell you, we're not unique. There's a lot of really good organizations, and whenever you have a best practice, you shouldn't be shy about picking up the phone and talking to each other and finding out, how did you accomplish that? Because we got the same goal in mind. One of the nice things about the Y as well is, yes, we invest all this money in our staff, we develop leaders, and then they take off. But you know what? If they go to another association and are successful, that's success. Because at the end of the day, they're going to remember how we treated and supported them. And when they're in a different capacity, they're either going to refer good people or they come back and sponsor and support us. So it's not a wasted effort.
Yeah. That's great. That's really perfect articulation of Sean and Francis's recommendation about this idea of building lattices, not just thinking about individual organizations. So thank you, Michael. Amari, Cassie, either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, you know, I think in regards to firms, and I think Common Good has led the way in a lot of sectors, including a report that they published a few years ago. But I also must admit that of the 3 jobs that I got placed by a firm, 2 of which were CEO jobs, only one firm placed me all 3 times. And so of the 5 firms that I know in Boston, like I've always felt like I was the diversity name. And in one case, I pulled myself out of it because I just got tired of doing it. So I've only got placed by one firm in all 3 of my executive jobs. So I guess I'm taking a survey in real time in front of everybody. I think some of the things that we can do, again, like I'm pretty stuck on us defining our own sector, including knowledge of our work and really challenging my own team and them challenging me around how we live our values. The first thing that, I must admit, my COO is also a black male, and so there's a couple of people of color. First thing that we did once we were a leadership team is that we raised, and I'm going to look over there because I might get my numbers wrong. I asked you to we raised everyone's salary to $20 an hour. That was the very first thing I did as a CEO because I knew that, right? I knew we weren't going to perpetuate that, and so having a leadership team to support that. And then the second thing is that I got to bring 2 pretty strong, socially conscious development leaders on staff. Because once we raised the salaries to $20 an hour, we increased our budget by, I want to say, $600,000 to $800,000 by just doing that. And we also created 12-week paid paternity, maternity, family leave. And so it increased our budget by $800,000 that we had to raise in 1 year, my first month there. And we were on track to raise it. And I think when part of it is when you get a team that believes in the same things that you do, finding $800,000 out of thin air is a daunting task, but you can do it. But we got to lead with our values. We can't consciously continue to perpetuate the same thing that our organization is working towards by hiring people at less than at $11 an hour, $15 an hour. So we weren't going to do that. So I think that, to me, that is a part of how I see what we can do as hiring managers or as incoming job seekers is to really, I'll leave you with one last example. If Belichick from the Patriots left the Patriots, we would not hire the losingest coach in high school football because winning, a culture of winning breeds a culture of winning. So you want to hire another winning coach to bring in that culture to the Patriots. So why do we hire people who are living very close to the poverty wage, who are almost clientized themselves to work on prosperity issues in communities that are facing issues of poverty, right? So you can't teach prosperity when someone is not living in prosperity. And I didn't say rich, but I mean prosperity, a living wage. And so I think modeling our values around what it means to be diverse, have equity, and have an inclusive organization. And I think there's a role for search firms and perhaps Common Good, and we can support Cassie, can lead the way to demand search firms change the paradigm in which they look for candidates. And again, I don't know who said it, but having brown people have to spend energy code switching in order to fit into a paradigm which is much like the mainstream that we're working on just doesn't make any sense anymore. And so I think that feels like a takeaway that I would add.
Thank you, Amari. Cassie, anything to add before we open it up? Okay. All right, let's go to questions. Or I first want to offer Sean and Francis anything to add before. Okay, I'll welcome questions for all of our panelists and or for the report authors, for Sean and Francis. And please ask a question. Please don't make a statement. And this is being live streamed, so we have folks with microphones, so please wait for one of them to get to you so our audience watching remotely can hear. And also feel free to tweet questions at #RaceToLead. Is that right? Is that the hashtag for tweeting questions? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Michelle, we have Jeff right there.
Hi, Jeff Poulos with Associated Grantmakers. I wonder for the funders on the panel, if you could talk about what some of the implicit biases and structural racism is, examples of that within the funding community. What structures are there that might be barriers that we look to address to think about changing in our sector?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jeff. I think that we can be just a little bit more smart around leading with our values, as you said, Amari. I think there are some areas that I've noticed that I see trends. So when we look at community development corporations, we tend to see white men leading that, okay? I know of a CDC nut in this city that is led by a woman of color, and she did not have a finance background, and questions come up about, well, how can she do this job if she has no finance background? But it was never asked. This person has no community background, and the woman had a law degree, so it's not like she can't learn it. So I feel like there are ways, I find it interesting, and I find, actually, I'll just personally say that a lot of people, when it comes to numbers, they start to talk to me in this almost like baby talk kind of language, and it's like, but I've taught statistics. Like, wait a minute, I'm fine with numbers. Just tell me what they are, But I feel like there's a way in which we take our stereotypes, and the challenge is we are well-meaning. We're a well-meaning sector, the nonprofit sector and philanthropy in general. We're trying, but sometimes we leave our blinders on at the very moment. We just need to take them off and be open to, maybe this is leadership that doesn't look like I expected to, but it's so aligned with the value that I can't even consider it a risk. So I think that that's part of what we can do. One, we can start to notice, what are we really looking for, and how does that match up and really kind of break open some of our own our stereotypes and break them open.
Selena.
So, as a recovering funder, so one of the things that strikes me, and it's an observation that from when I started in philanthropy to now, is that the ecosystem has changed drastically, and the organizations that are valued the most or held up as being the most successful tend to be organizations that are very singularly focused. And, some folks would say, well, they are great. They know what they are good at, and they stick to it. An organization that has come out of community need, such as my organization and other organizations that are organizations that were started by people of color, for people of color, do not necessarily walk a straight line all the time. You see an immediate need that comes up, and you have a sense of responsibility that you need to respond. That doesn't mean that you lost sight of the end game and where you're headed. It just means that I had no choice. I had to respond to the needs that the community was presenting. And it may mean that I need to work with the other organization down the street to come together and figure out a plan. So that might mean that my outcomes may not look so great, right? Or I may not hit them exactly the way I intended to, but it doesn't mean that I stopped doing good work or that I lost sight of my mission, because my mission and my purpose is broader than just making sure that more kids graduate from college that particular year. And that, I think, it's that we've lost sense of sort of valuing the whole, and instead very singularly focused. I mean, I can't tell you how often I had to sort of feel like the broker or the translator for the organizations that were being led by people of color in communities of color. And had to do that because I felt like sort of who was there, the audience, did not understand the particular way that some organizations need to work.
Yeah, and just one final thing. I think we also downplay the degree to which people of color have to work against racism within nonprofit organizations. Even, we are not immune to sort of the racism of American society. So you'll find it in all kinds of organizations, be they people of color led or white led, but particularly in white led organizations where there is that isolation or that one candidate, and that one candidate, that one person, that one staffer has to fight the battle of racism, you know, in an isolated situation where it may make them feel like there's nobody else like me, this must be me. And that's where I noticed in the report, peer support becomes really, really critical outside the organization, because we sort of ignore the fact, because we are, you know, trying to get people in homes, we're trying to get kids educated. So what, you want me to look at racism in my organization? Well, yeah, we do. And so I think that that's something that, you know, we can do in philanthropy and encourage in nonprofit organizations. And by encourage, I mean fund it. So it's like not that project, but it's like the need to build capacity of my staff. I need money for that. So.
Yeah, Cassie, did you want to
Yeah,
jump
I
in?
wanted to say that Common Good Careers is fortunate to have been included in a pretty significant investment by the Kresge Foundation, whereby they selected 6 service providers that provide different types of service to nonprofit organizations and offered that out to their grantee organizations. And so organizations could choose which of the, you know, select organizations could choose which of these service providers they wanted to work with, but it was all about leadership development and pipeline development with a race and equity lens. So that kind of thing is, you know, an example of a foundation making a significant investment for their grantees in this area.
I think, Michael, did you have something to add?
You mentioned about peer support mattering. I also think peer pressure matters. So we have a lot of we have 900 Y associations across the nation, and of which there's about 80 or 90 that are very large Ys, like in excess of 30 million up to several hundred million. And some of them are old school and some are sort of modern. But when we have a situation where we think there's activities that are less than favorable, there's a little bit of discrimination or something going on, the pressure from their peers help correct those matters. And organizations need to band together and speak up, because they may not speak to or address the issue the way I would want as their chief HR officer, but when they hear their fellow colleagues, their fellow funders, the individuals that basically are their sole source saying we're not putting up with that, it makes a huge difference. And then it also paints the organization as somewhere as a destination of choice. When you don't do that, what happens is you get blackmarked. You get a situation where no one's applying for your positions, and it's not about pay. It's about what's out there on the circuit that's saying that's not a really good place for people of color. So that's one way. So peer pressure helps, and support.
Okay, Sean.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on the question of like really practical factors in terms of what the sort of grant maker rules of engagement end up being that end up having could potentially have a biased impact. So questions like, are grant making processes like everyone can apply and submit a proposal, or are proposals by invitation only, right? Like if it's by invitation only, then that's going to privilege the relationships that exist with the existing grant makers. Also questions like, what are the budget sizes that a foundation will invest in, because we know that organizations led by people of color tend to have smaller budgets. And so if all of the organizations in a region that are led by people of color have a budget size that is below the threshold, then they're never going to have a chance to get into the funding pool. So those are two like just really practical structural things that I think have to do with the choices that funders make to make their jobs a little easier. I'm sure it would take a lot more time and staffing to be able to read through an open proposal process, but you know, those are the choices and trade-offs that are being made that can have biased impacts.
Great. Great. I'm afraid we have time for just one more question. So let's go right here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marie-Rose Murphy, and I'm a management consultant, and I've worked in this area for over 20 years, executive leader and everything else. And but also for the past 8 years, the other hat I've been wearing, I've been So I'm the co-founder of the Haiti Community Foundation, so working in international development. I'm trying very hard not to make a statement. So, but it's been interesting because on the international level, I've watched some of the same conversation. I've been involved in conversation in all over the world, like Switzerland, in England, in Africa, about the localization of aid, where very little money goes to developing countries or local organizations of developing countries as opposed to Western countries, global North, global South. And there are some of the same conversation about, all people of color or black and brown people or local organizations of what used to be called third world countries are valued, or their capacity and everything else. So it's fascinating. But the question that I have, the same way that I'm sort of everywhere, that I've been sort of like questioning whether people are really interested in changing the system, is whether or not people really see the lack of diversity and inclusion being a problem. And I'm not, this is not a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
Because there's a part of me that just wants to hear yes.
Yeah.
Except that there's another part of me, I'm like, really?
Okay.
And that's the question that I have, because I just want to add that I think that there is, people are not facing their issues of prejudices, and we all have them, frankly. And if we don't face them, we just act on them.
Yep. Yep.
So
a lot of really important questions in there. Does anyone want to volunteer to tackle that?
I think that is the subtext of the comments that I'm making. Like, do people actually see it as a problem? And I think on one note, we were saying yes, but there's nothing about the structure or the systems that says that we actually believe that. And if anything, I think I was just trying to say, here are like some small things that we can do as employees or social justice leaders in our sector to actually answer yes to that question in an authentic way. Because I think in our hearts and our minds, we want to say, yes, we think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a problem with our sector, but I don't think there's anything about our structure, systems, or behaviors that that actually make that seem like a credible question. And I think that's right. And I really think that a take home that everyone can do is, it has nothing to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, is to find out who the founder of your organization. And if your founder is a person of color and they're not on your website, then that's a small step, right? Like, we're making invisible the leaders of our institutions. I think Boston is the Athens, they say it's the Athens of higher ed, but it's also the Athens of the nonprofit sector, right? And so the first community health center, some of the first settlement houses, some of the first leaders, the leaders that came before. If we don't know who these leaders are in our own sector, where it's okay that we work in a sector that we actually don't know about our sector, then that is as silly as when we have conversations with folks around privilege, when they are trying to tell us about how privilege is this and that, and they actually don't know. It is the same thing when we can work in communities and that we actually don't know the history of the community. I'm not just talking about, I've been on blah, blah, blah street, but really understand why blah, blah, blah street exists in the way that it does in the sector that we've actually chosen to work in. Then I think we contribute to it. And I think that's a small step. Do a Google search around our sector, gain knowledge around, our industry. And I think I don't think you have to do, the first step is not to do an action, is just to do the work yourself. And I think that's where it starts.
Great. I'd love to actually, because we're almost at time, just go down the line and offer closing thoughts and reflections. So thanks for kicking us off, Amari.
Perfect. So my closing thought actually goes back to, I think, where I started in the last comment we got, is I wonder if we really know that diversity is a value. So again, this is not about doing people of color a favor by giving them a leadership position, because the ED job is really hard, just let me put it that way. But to really make sure that we understand why we value diversity and inclusion. I think we forget that, and that how do we then allow for that very resource to show up in efficacy? If we care about that in philanthropy, if we care about making a difference and being effective, then I think we have to care about that. We have to value diversity and inclusion beyond, look, we have 10 people of color here. It really has to be, and how does their leadership, how did that reshape the work that you're doing, and how is it more effective? So that's my closing.
Thank you. Selena.
So I'm trying to come up with one coherent thought because there's lots of thoughts going on, because I do think that part of what we need to do is have more of these conversations. I am actually glad as I look out to see not a sea of brown and black faces and Asian faces, because I have been in the philanthropy side many a times where this conversation is being had and you're preaching to the choir. So I am heartened by that. I think that's great. I do think that, getting back to your very important question, I wish I could sit here and say that I'm hopeful that structurally we're making great gains and advancing. In fact, I left philanthropy because I was feeling like there was no place for me to go, and I was ready to lead. So that was part of it. I also got tired of working in settings where I feel like I was the voice of diversity and inclusion and race. Let's talk about it. I wish there was more unpacking that was happening and more understanding of really looking at portfolios, looking at how we structure ourselves. Are we by invitation only? I was the program officer that it didn't matter who called me, I would call you back, because I was very aware of my privilege and where I sat, and not you deserve at least a call back from me. So there is a lot of work to do in order to change the structure in a way that really equity, we can talk about equity, because there is no equity. And that is a big challenge. I am hopeful that we will continue to work towards that, but I think there is a ways to go.
Thank you. Cassie.
I don't think we do enough to value diversity, equity, and inclusion in this country at all. And I think the challenge is moving from theory to practice, because I think that being able to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a theoretical sense is a privilege that people who look like me have. And then the challenge becomes acting on that as a leader, and in the role that whatever role you have, by changing the wage structure at your organization or changing the medical leave policies. Those are the actions that are going to demonstrate that commitment. And I think I'm talking too much generally in the theory.
Thank you. Amara, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, I'll say something quick. I think we have to demand that our nonprofit leaders represent people and issues first and not their organizations. And so when I think about leaders like Mel King and Hubie Jones, they represented issues, and the organizations that they ran were manifestations of the issues that they represented. And now we're becoming nonprofit executive directors where we're running social justice enterprises. And I think we got to shift that paradigm and get back to where leaders, demand that leaders stand on issues and on people and less about agencies.
Michael.
And there's so many things to address, but I think, and when I think about my career success, I think about who sponsored me, who was in my corner and spoke on my behalf and supported me. So like Hubie Jones and different individuals. And I think we all can, in one way or another, develop systems of support and sponsorship for leaders of color and take those chances and risks. And I think it will start to change the paradigm. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm very optimistic.
Great. Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel. And Sean and Francis as well. Thank you, Sean and Francis. So this is, as Orlando said at the beginning of his remarks, this is, one in a series of conversations that we're having, where we will welcome you back in June to talk specifically about racial inequity on boards. And we'd love to hear from you. I would love to, and my team would love to hear from you about other topics and other programs that we can do to move us forward towards actual change. So thanks so much for coming. Enjoy the day.